Fire Emblem, the game series that I've only recently gotten back into ever since the 3DS game started coming out, and all of them have been pretty solid so far. I mean, some are better than others. Awakening definitely got a lot more mileage out of, but I've definitely had my time with plenty of the other Fire Emblem games that have been recently released, and it was only a matter of time before, well, the Switch made its presence, and I started to think about how a Fire Emblem game on the Switch would turn out. A couple months back, Nintendo held their Switch presentation. They showed off a couple of games, Zelda being the launch title, a Mario title being on its way, and a couple of other first and third party games. However, one title in particular captivated me. A trailer showing multiple gems reflecting certain swords. I recognized all of them, one being the Falchion, the Yato, the Siegfried, the Raijinto, and Mars Falchion. And built up to the Shield of Flames, and there it was. Fire Emblem Muso, otherwise known as Fire Emblem Warriors. If you remember a couple months back, I kinda hinted that I was a little excited for it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, a lot, and I'd had to be done with Rarity because of course. I am a fan of the Fire Emblem games. I started with the GBA series after all, but I'm not really familiar with the Dynasty Warriors franchise. Oh, I've heard of it. I mean, to my understanding of the series, it's essentially where you're a one-man army, slaughtering thousands in your path, conquering castles, and crushing your opponent.
Feel the power of my magic!
I've heard that there's some strategy elements in the game, but they're very slim, mostly guiding your unit across the plane. So if that's the case, why was I excited for it? I mean, it's Dynasty Warriors only with Fire Emblem, right? Well, this wasn't the only time that Koei Tecmo and Team Ninja used a Nintendo property for their Dynasty Warriors franchise, Hyrule Warriors, which was released a couple years back, where they brought Legend of Zelda into the games. And I've heard great things about the game, how addictive it is, and how much fan service and respect they had for the property they had for it. So I was thinking if they did that game well, then Fire Emblem Warriors seems more of a match made in heaven for them. Fire Emblem makes a lot more sense for the Dynasty Warriors genre, using medieval weapons, going up against armies, and being vastly superior despite smaller numbers, so it really felt that it could work, and if Koei Tecmo could get the same amount of respect for the series that they did with Hyrule Warriors, I felt the game could be in good hands. And this was a series that I was more familiar with. I wasn't that interested in Hyrule Warriors because I'm not a Zelda fan, so maybe I could be for this game? So the game finally came out in Japan a couple of weeks back, and the Switch is reason-free, so I can download the game. I went through a couple of struggles with that one, to be honest. And sure, it will all be in Japanese, but I don't think that would be too much of an issue considering how Dynasty Warriors works. So does this game live up to my hype, or should have this been left in the back burner? Well, let's take a look. This won't be a review per se, just me expressing my thoughts on my experience with Fire Emblem Warriors. First, I should preface this footage as well as myself for this matter. This game is all in Japanese, and I don't speak a lick of it. I mean, I can recognize a couple of phrases here and there, but other than that, I have no idea on what these people are talking about. So will not be talking about this game in terms of story and dialogue, unfortunately. I mean, from what I've read from certain translations, there are some good references here and there, so I hope that some of those actually do maintain into the English version of the game. There's one in particular that I wanted to know. But to my understanding of the story and the cutscenes and whatnot, it doesn't seem like a story that is really too hard to understand. The main characters are these two kids, Rowan and Liana. Their home gets destroyed by these mysterious creatures, and the kids have to venture outside their land to find help, and that's where they meet different characters from each of the Fire Emblem games. Only 3, though, unfortunately, for the main story. First Awakening, then Fate's characters, and finally Shadow Dragon. But from what I can tell, they do work the games they got rather well, using story sections from each of the games as well as character plots and scenarios to overcome in each of the maps. I'll go over this in detail when the game actually comes out in English. At least then I can understand some things and probably find a reason as to why most of the Fate characters wants me dead. Seriously, Takumi pulls his bow on me even after I rescued his sisters on my team. What's worse is that I can bring Hinoka along and he still fires at me, even though he knows that he can kill his sister with a couple of arrows. Oh, Leo does the same thing in the Conquest path, but Takumi is much worse because he knows his sister's weakness. On the other side, it was actually nice to listen to the Japanese dialogue for the first time for these characters. Yu Kobayashi does a great job as Lucina. Korin's voice actually sounds super sweet and rather cute, And after listening to Niles' Japanese voice, I now totally understand why you got the same-sex marriage option for the males. The only one whose voice that I didn't like that much was Oberos. Like, take a listen.
白夜のものではありませんし、アンヤともかなり異なる仕立てだったんです。
Does anyone else get like she's someone's grandma out of her voice? It doesn't seem appropriate for someone who looks like they're in their young adult years. Now, you might be wondering on why I decided to play this game without knowing the language, or even how I could play it or enjoy it without it. Well, that's where the gameplay comes in, and that's what I wanted to focus on about this game, and I don't really need to know Japanese in order to figure this out. It's a Warriors title, so nothing too complex in order to actually do things. I mean, there was the occasional on-screen message where I have to break out the phone and use Google Translate, but they do point out into one thing you have to do, especially if you set it to the slower gameplay setting, where the game pauses whenever a new mission pops up. Yeah, that's a setting in this game. You can choose whether you want it into the hasty or slower setting, and the hasty just skips through the level ups and the new mission select screen, which keeps the action going. But if you use the slower setting, the game pauses every time there's a new slower message set up, and whenever a character levels up. If you want my honest opinion, I recommend that people actually do stick to the slower setting at first and then switch to hasty later, because when you're in the slower setting, you will always be interrupted by the level up screen, and it is charming at first, but it gets annoying after a while. At least in the hasty setting, the action keeps going and you can keep playing. So that's my recommendation. So how's the general gameplay like? Well, on the surface, and how it is generally, it's Dynasty Warriors. You're essentially a one-man army about to take apart thousands upon thousands of units standing in your way. You mostly use the Y and X button to deal with your attacks, the Y being your light attack and the X being your heavy. You can chain combos together by just pressing the Y a couple of times and then ending it with X, but the gameplay from the base level isn't too complicated. But like Dynasty Warriors, you move your player character from one end to the map to the other, taking down enemy forts and the occasional boss enemy that comes around to try and take over your home base or trying to kill you. It's expected out of Dynasty Warriors, but fret not, because that's not all you can do in this game. To my knowledge and some experience from Dynasty Warriors, when you choose your player character, you are stuck with them for the entire map, meaning that if something is going on the other side of the map, you need to get your butt over there because your other teammates on the battlefield can't do it themselves. The AI isn't that great, and you're basically the one guy with the brain. Not in the case with Fire Emblem Warriors though, and I'm rather impressed by this. You can choose up to 4 other playable units to deploy on the battlefield per map, and 4 other non-playable units on the map, and you can switch between the player characters anytime with a simple press of the up and down on the D-pad, and it's pretty fluent too. Have a mission where the character you're playing as on the other side of the map and there's another character already there, switch to that character and finish the fight and let the AI control your once previously controlled character. Speaking of which, the AI in this game is pretty reliable, surprisingly, so long as they're not going up against any enemy that is clearly obvious that they're weak to, like a Pegasus Knight going against an archer. They will do the job just fine, and even take over properties too. I'm rather surprised that they can actually think for themselves in that case. Just don't ask them to fight against the same enemy you're fighting, because apparently these units suffer from massive performance anxiety when you're around. But overall, the AI is pretty reliable. You can command them to go on the menu, and they will go to that place and do what they ask of you. There might be some issues here and there, because whenever you don't give them an order, they like to roam around the battlefield aimlessly and sometimes end up facing a unit that they're not prepared for, being on the other side of the battlefield when they shouldn't be. But hey, that's what guiding them and pointing them out in the right direction is for, right? It's a simple click on the menu, and it doesn't feel like any trouble at all to do so. Actually, switching between different units on the battlefield is totally exhilarating for me, if I can keep the action going by switching between different units as they're taking on another battle. If my unit is done with whatever they're fighting, I go to the menu, tell them to go to a new area on the map, and while they're walking over there, I switch to another unit in combat and finish their fight. It keeps the action going. There's hardly any moments where I got bored or felt that things got pretty dull and repetitive, because the game encourages using a variety of units. Switching between them in different fighting styles on the fly keeps things going for me. And because some of the weapons are very different from each other, it doesn't seem like you're being repetitive unless you decide to, well, use the clones. And yeah, that goes into probably another major criticism toward the game. There's a total of 25 characters in the game. 3 that are unlockable, and the rest are obtained through story mode. Unfortunately, some of the characters do have a similar moveset to each other, as their combos are the same, their ending moves, and the way they fight too. Rowan and Leona are probably the worst about this, mostly because they're the main characters of the game and you can select between the two. Only really their awakening criticals are different. They're clones in moveset only though, because their stats and skill differences between the two are more reflect on how they should be. Say that Lucina has a more resistance compared to Chrome, and Elise is able to heal others, while Leo is more offensive and defensive. And actually, this feels more in line with how Fire Emblem does its units. I mean, think about it. Sometimes you receive like the different gendered versions of each characters. Even say like the Cavalier units, the red and green units, they only differ in stats and looks. So honestly, this isn't really that big a deal for me. There's even this one mission where I had to play as all three of the axe users, and the axe users actually have the most variety because one's on a dragon, one's on a horse, and one's on their foot. And there's one major criticism I have with the roster, and it's the weapon variety. I really don't mind the amount of sword users in the game, because that's where the programmers actually get more creative with their moveset. Seriously, folks like Lucina, Lyn, and Xander are probably like some of the funnest characters to play as. And also, it is more in line with Fire Emblem because swords are the most popular weapon out of the bunch. No, the major criticism goes to the lance users. They're only Pegasus Knights that represent them, meaning that you only have one playstyle to work with them, and a very unwieldy one at that. Takes a long time to get used to. They're weak to archers, and they're not really the strongest units in the bunch. Oh, Hinoka tries her best, definitely, but compared to, say, Frederick or something, yeah, I don't think she does too well against that. Oh, there's Oboro, who appears in cutscenes and definitely goes as an NPC where she fights you a couple of times, but that's it. She's not playable for some reason. I still find it odd that they include all these Fates characters in it, and yet Azura is in here. Another pretty crappy thing is the characters are only limited to one weapon. In the Fire Emblem games, some of the characters can wield multiple weapons, like Cavaliers can wield both swords and lances. Frederick is probably the worst at this because he can wield all three. And yeah, his special shows him using all weapon types, starting with a lance and sword and then finishing with an axe. But it sucks that he only limits himself to that weapon. Oh, and he's probably one of the funnest characters to use, but still. Speaking of which, in the characters and going more positively, I used the majority of the characters in the game, with only a couple that I felt that I haven't used as much as others, like Leo, unfortunately. All the sword users are fun to play as and has the most variety and speed. Axe users have nice variants, hits like a truck, and are all fun to play as. I've said my piece on the lance users, but they all got great speed and traverse the battlefield quite well. The magic users and archers make for great crowd control too. Seriously, the archers in particular, you wouldn't think that they could take care of ways upon units, but they can, and they kick ass for it. I mean, I may not like Takumi that much back in his game, but much like my Birthright playthrough and the end of Conquest, I won't deny him being one of the best units to use, and probably the one that would kick my ass. If you want my recommendation for which units I use the most in my playthrough, I mostly use Lucina for her speed. Corrin has great crowd control, and when she's upgraded, her moves where she actually involves her dragon powers a lot makes for some great spread and crowd control. It's really good. Camilla can travel on the battlefield with relative ease. Takumi, as I've said earlier, is fantastic for taking on crowds. And Lissa can do this. And folks said that this game wouldn't be impressive. Speaking as a Fire Emblem fan with no prior experience to Dynasty Warriors whatsoever, I found Fire Emblem Warriors to be surprisingly observing. It's fun to try out the different characters, see if I can improve my speed on certain maps, and take on the history mode. Oh yes, the story mode ends within the first 18 hours of the game, and admittedly, when I played on normal difficulty for it, I barely had trouble whatsoever. So I kind of recommend that you play on hard mode for that one. And, well, history mode is where the game time doubles and where you actually get the most variety. History mode is where the game takes a chapter from each of the different Fire Emblems in their game, and you can traverse the map by taking on different challenges represented by units on their sprites, like arenas, or defeat a certain amount of enemies, or take on a map where you have to take over a castle. Stuff like that. Stuff that you've been doing on the maps, but they also had some very nice twists here and there, like when clones started coming up in Lyn's map. That was fun. However, this could also lead to the game's greatest challenges, and where the game actually gets pretty fun too. This is where you can also get the alternative gendered versions of Corrin and Robin as costumes, invisible ties in particular, and they actually do work it into the story rather well. You can get bonus characters in the game like Lyn and Celica, and you can also get Anna in there. Be careful though, because that could also lead into the hardest maps in the game in terms of level progression. I call this one the Hoshiden Family Reunion, where everyone in the Hoshiden family decided to pay me a visit in my base. And they were all upgraded, and they all wanted me dead. I was really lucky that I got this on footage, let's just say. Anyways, thoughts so far on Fire Emblem Warriors? It's fun. Probably the most fun and addicting gameplay experiences I've had this year. I poured plenty of my spare time into this game, motivated by getting some of the newer characters, going for each of the Anna's memories to fill out the pictures, and completing the history mode maps, and doing better in the story mode by playing on higher difficulties. It's a very fun experience, and speaking as someone who loves to do ridiculous stuff in Fire Emblem and being very strategic about it, this has nothing but been a treat for me. I can definitely say that I enjoyed myself and then some. Again, from a gameplay perspective, there's probably some other bits of fan service and otherwise in text, but I'm definitely playing this game in English for when it releases, and, well, I'm going to have a great time with that one too. Definitely going to try out hard classic mode because there is a classic difficulty where you had a permadeath feature of the game. And it might be fun to actually try and be a little more careful with my actions because there were only like a handful of times in story mode where some of my units died. But yeah, if you played Dynasty Warriors before, I'm pretty sure you'll enjoy this one just fine, especially when you have the ability to play as different characters with each with different playstyles, probably relieving you from the idea of trying to reverse from one end of the battlefield to another. There is one question, however, and I'll probably save this for the next one, is that how would this compare with Hyrule Warriors? But I guess we'll just say that as another time. With that said, I am DMikami, this is DM13000, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time for the next video. See you everyone.